The following presentation is part of the Beyond the Blast Doors network.
This is Pete Fletzer. On this episode of Around the Galaxy, we are pleased to be joined by author Claudia Gray. Join us as we talk about Princess Leia, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Baby Yoda, and Jean-Luc Picard. So strap yourselves in, relax, and enjoy this journey around the galaxy.
We're having roast
Why we're here.
I'm going to
Good.
feel like 100,000
Deal. No worries.
It's like
nice to be saying, and we are actually seeing each other.
an hour and a half.
And this is like the first time we've ever talked, which is quite
Started. Claudia, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm very excited to be speaking to you today and enjoying this beautiful Memorial Day here at least in Jersey. It's beautiful. I don't know. You're located in what, Louisiana, right?
I'm in New Orleans,
New
where
Orleans.
we kind of zoomed right past beautiful in the hardest part of lockdown, and now it's raging heat. All these things going, hey, it's a lot safer to be outside. And it's like, oh.
Hope that air conditioning works, right? And
Yeah, it's hit 90 a couple times already.
Oh.
I'm ill for the rest of the summer, but it looks nice,
and that's New Orleans for you, so that's cool.
Yeah,
I have some family down there, so I've been there a few times, so that's great.
Yeah, I love it here, but I did not move for the climate.
No. So I know a lot of people are very familiar with Lost Stars and Bloodline and Master and Apprentice and Leia, Princess of Alderaan, but maybe I'd like to kind of start and just sort of understand your journey from sort of young adult author to Star Wars author. I mean,
Okay.
that's kind of a it's certainly you're certainly walking into a group of very rabid fans. So how did you get there? How did you get your first Star Wars novel?
Well, I had known for a long time an editor who wound up working for Star Wars, but we didn't actually meet in a professional capacity. We met as fans, not even as fans of Star Wars, but had figured out that we both loved Star Wars. And so we had talked about it, had gone, I think we went and saw Revenge of the Sith together. I'm not sure. I think she was there. Anyway, we had known each other a very long time, and she knew how much I loved the entire universe.
Right.
And that still didn't, when she went to work for Star Wars, it still didn't occur to me that she might reach out to me for that, because at the time, sorry, I've got this on my lap, so it's shaking.
That's all right.
Did you see the Prime Minister of New Zealand this morning?
No, what
She
happened?
was on a live television show and an earthquake happened, and she was like, oh, we're having a bit of a rumbler here. It's all right. Like, she just went on through it like it was no big deal.
That's what happens.
Yeah, no earthquake here. It's just me adjusting this. I also apologize for any background noise. We just got our new dog from the shelter about a week and a half ago, and she wants to be up here in the bed, and she has mixed feelings about being in anyone's space. So suddenly a furry missile.
That's all right. My dog Charlie sometimes makes an appearance, whether I want him to or not. So it's all good.
Anyway, it didn't occur to me that she would reach out, because back in the day, you went straight from sort of chapter readers,
Right.
to adult books. There really wasn't any sort of Star Wars publishing in the middle there. And the first I heard of it at all was getting an email going, hey, we have this idea. Could you submit an outline for this idea? And I was super thrilled to get it. And a lot of people have been like, oh, it's such a huge fandom. Were you intimidated? And I wasn't. I ought to have been. But somehow, despite the fact that I owned, I don't even know how many Holdo books. I can't even count. I always just talk about real snapshot in time, going to Walden Books in the mall.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Those first Timothy Zahn books when they first came out, so I should have known, I should have been nervous, but I wasn't. I was just super psyched about it. I just somehow did not understand how many people were out there.
Now, were you a big Star Wars fan before you got into writing, or was that part of your growth? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, it came out when I was 6. I saw it the first time when I was 6 or 7. My birthday's in a couple weeks, so I don't know whether it was before or after the birthday, but that is the prime age to just have your relationship to reality severed forever. And, I was a huge fan of it my whole life. Like, I don't really remember a time before it. I was talking about this once at a con, and I was like, who would I be without Star Wars? Like, would I be into sports or something? I could be an entirely different kind of human being if I had not been rendered nerdy very early on.
So did it and you, so yeah, I was going to ask if you feel like that influenced your decision to write, but clearly it did. I mean, and the non-Star Wars books you write tend to be in a fantasy universe as well. So I guess it drew you into that.
Yeah, I've always loved that stuff, always. I mean, my grandparents had these books. It was Reader's Digest, Tales of the Unexplained, and Strange Stories, Amazing Facts. There were no facts in that book. But, and they were just all these accounts of anything that might be considered weird. And I mean, it was a very, very all-encompassing definition for that. Like, the Jersey Devil, the Titanic, cryogenics. anything that could eventually have become an episode of the X-Files was in that. And I read that stuff backward and forward and was always drawn to things that whether it's science fiction or fantasy. People always act like you have to pick one of those. I think most people who like one at least kind of like some of the other. And tons of us love both. Reality clearly has little to recommend it sometimes.
Well, it's interesting because I think that there is, I definitely agree. And I think it's funny. I've had those occasional conversations where people will say, "Oh, you like Star Wars? My son loves Star Trek. You guys should talk to each other." And I'm like, Star Trek and Star Wars are a little bit different, but it's a different type of world. But I think the sci-fi and the fantasy together definitely makes sense. Like I got drawn into the Game of Thrones series and that sort of thing. So I think that there's definitely
I'm both a huge Star Wars fan and a huge Trekkie. I've managed to find Star Trek references in a few Star Wars novels now, and I won't stop. I will never stop.
What's your favorite Star Trek reference that people may have missed in one of your books?
The first one, definitely, because the planet that in Lost Stars that Thane and Ciana come from is Jellican. If you take the middle 3 letters out and put them at the end, you have Jean-Luc.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. That's great. So are you a next generation or are you like all Star Trek? What's your
I like almost all Star Trek. I have to admit that Enterprise kind of lost me. But Next Gen was the one that I really imprinted on very hard. Although I actually became a Star Trek fan, not through any of the TV shows. They didn't rerun the classic Trek where I was, but the novels.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I picked up The Enterprise Incident by Vonda M. McIntyre, which was sort of the first one of the pocket Star Wars novels that they did. And I was reading it back, I think I was 12, and it was something like, when Captain Kirk is killed in a such and such so-and-so, and I was like, and just living in the world, that Captain Kirk is a big deal, and he's in this, and I was like, he gets killed, I don't understand, so I get this book, and I loved it, and I have to admit, I know modern tie-in novels, it's a different story now, and we're canon, and we all have to agree. I dug the way they did it back with Star Trek. It was just every single book. Those first few years, they print anything. It was great.
Oh, yeah.
Spock becomes a space pirate. Boom, Black Fire. That was a good one. They go to a planet where the entire population has decided to ward off both the Federation and the Klingons by doing musical comedy numbers set to Gilbert and Sullivan songs. It's a real one. How much to bust the planet. It's awesome. I loved it. Like literally anything that came out of somebody's brain, they would put in the books, and I still love that. I had a ball with that.
Yeah, I remember I was the first time I had just started doing some work for Star Wars Galaxy magazine, and so I was having a lunch with Steve Sansweet because he was at one of the Star Trek conventions, because that's what they did. There was no Star Wars Celebration yet, right? So he would come and he would speak there.
Modern con, yeah.
Exactly. And we had a great conversation over lunch about how the Star Trek novels are sort of the stories about the reality quote unquote, that is the television series, and just sort of how they're connected. And I remember, it's funny you talk about that, because I remember he was talking about the same thing, because he was a fan of those novels that the crazier they were, the better, in a way. So
and a lot of those novelists wound up having pretty big careers. Diane Duane, Vonda McIntyre herself, A.C. Crispin,
right?
Jean Laura. There were a lot of people that either broke in that way, or they'd gotten interested in through fan fiction, had published some original things, and then came back and did the most fanficky thing you could imagine for book. And again, I loved it.
That's great. Do you think there's a possibility of a Star Trek novel on the horizon for you someday?
If I were ever asked, I would almost have to say yes. Like, otherwise, like, teenage me would come forward in time and like, what are you doing? But, I would want it to be something that I could do well.
Right.
Like, I would love to write a Star Trek Picard novel. Obviously, Picard is a big character for me.
Yeah.
And whereas I enjoyed like Voyager, but a novel concentrating on Voyager, probably I'm not going to be the greatest writer for. But you never know. You never know.
So you mentioned that you can't live in the world without knowing who Captain Kirk is, right? And you can't live in the world without knowing who Princess Leia is.
Yeah.
And you had the opportunity twice to help build that character. So what I wanted to ask you about was, a lot of people ask you about, this scene and that scene, and your books are just quite often, and I'm not saying this because you're on with me now, but when I ask people what their favorite Star Wars books are, yours always tend to come up in the tops. That's which is really amazing. And I think a lot of it is because of the character building you did for Leia. How do you approach that? Because you grew up with her. You and I are on, we saw the movies around the same age. You grew up with her. She's got this history. How do you approach writing what will be really molding this character for the sequel trilogy and for her for forever from that point forward?
I joke that the best thing about writing Princess Leia is everybody knows who she is, and the worst thing about writing Princess Leia is everyone knows who she is. And
right.
So yeah, it's a big thing because everybody loves her and everybody sees, different little facets of her that they adore. But on the other hand, if you grew up loving Star Wars, I think not solely, but particularly as a little girl, you spent a lot of your life going like, what would it be like to be Princess Leia? So, all of it got to be preparation in the end, because, I had thought about this a lot when I could have been doing other things. Although, as it turns out, this was all the career preparation. This is exactly what I was supposed to be doing, which is terrifying to think back on. But yeah, and it was just a matter of, or I feel like it was a matter of trying to encompass all of her, because don't get me wrong, I bought so many EU books. I love so many of them, but Leia often kind of got the boring parts.
Yeah. Yep.
She was at the Senate, and what was that dude, that one guy, I could never remember his name anymore. There was that one awful alien guy who was always messing with her, and those were never the most fun parts. And and I was like, okay, Leia was in politics, she'd be involved, but this is somebody who is hands-on, who is active, who she didn't like sit somewhere in a bunker and make little plans that she sent out to the rebellion. She was there with a blaster in the shelters. She was there the entire time. And so for me, it was really active it was important to concentrate on that active part of her, because she's not passive. Which is an amazing thing to say about a character that we meet captured and imprisoned, but she's not. The second they spring her, boom, she's back at it. And and think about what had happened to her that day. She'd been horribly tortured, and then she watched her entire planet get blown up.
Right.
Pretty much everybody she's ever known is dead, and she keeps going.
Yeah.
She keeps going. And so I tried to concentrate on that. This is a person who is going to try to act. And sometimes she may even act when it might have been better to hold off for a second.
Right.
She's going to be going, she's going to aim straight ahead at the problem every time. And that was, I don't know, I guess that's the main thing I think about.
No, and I think I love the way her character, as you said, I mean, the first time we see her, she's shooting a gun at a stormtrooper. Well, the second time we see her, right? Later in that same scene anyway. But
and then she wakes up from stun. And what's the first thing she does? She sasses Darth Vader.
Right. Exactly.
Like Darth Vader, who is like pants wettingly terrifying.
Right.
He's still got basically the equivalent of a head injury, and she's given it to him.
Exactly. And I think that's why. Also, if you take a character like Han Solo, who she ends up with, who's also kind of petulant and doesn't think and just does sort of, whereas Leia's strategically petulant, perhaps, and Han Solo's kind of like, I hope this works. How did you approach writing? Really, you've given us the most sort of direct insight into their relationship as well. And it's interesting because I think the Star Wars universe, a fandom, and I can't speak for everybody, of course, but there's the romance side of Star Wars has started to sort of bubble to the surface, at least with a broad sense, a broad group of our of the fandom. And so approaching that, did you have any specific approach when you went into that, or?
Again, I've been thinking about Han and Leia my whole life, and that was the one thing. I wrote both Lost Stars and Bloodline before The Force Awakens came out, but I had to know a little bit more about The Force Awakens to write Bloodline. That said, they didn't tell me much.
Right.
But, I knew that Han and Leia would still be together, and it was important to me to show how they were good for each other and how they would have compromised, because they're leading radically different lives. Han's never going to be happy, dealing with diplomacy or politics on a regular basis or staying at home all the time. He's just not. She wouldn't be satisfied going off and leading a life that was really primarily about just her or even just her family. She is very dedicated to service. So the idea that they sort of had this marriage that takes place in different times and they meet up and they're together and then they'll lead separate lives for a bit while they're still connected. I thought it was both the compromise they would reach and a thing that can be deeply loving. But in my head, at least, I also thought it maybe sort of set up some of what was going to happen after Ben turned, because, a tragedy like that can destroy a marriage if you look at like statistics of what happens after things like this. And it was important to me both to show that just because they failed when something terrible happened, it didn't mean that what went before wasn't important and meaningful. But also that maybe in giving each other so much room to lead their own lives, like they hadn't learned a couple things about compromise, or unity that they might have had to learn if they'd approached it a different way. I don't know. We'll never know.
So you bring up an interesting question that when I had Jason Fry on, I thought it was very interesting to understand what he knew about The Last Jedi and how obviously he knew a lot about it, but he didn't see the film, right? But he had seen the script. How much did you know about Force Awakens as you were putting it together? You said you knew some about it, but how did that whole process work with the story group, and how do you approach a novel that comes out before the return of the franchise?
In the case of The Force Awakens, I didn't know much. I had basically written Lost Stars, and at the end they said, listen, if instead of having the Star Destroyer blow up in space, you have it crash onto a planet called Jakku, we can tie that into the movie. And I thought, oh, cool, So I did that little bit of editing and turned it in. And that same day was when that second trailer came out. And you hear the John Williams music, and Rey on her speeder is going past the crashed Star Destroyer.
Right.
That was my fan apex moment. It's never going to get any better than that. It can't. It just can't. But then when it came to Bloodline, I had to know a little bit more. But they told me, Ben Solo is Kylo Ren. Han and Leia were together. They broke up right around the time that he turned. We're not exactly sure when that is, so I had to be really vague with time at that point. And a few things about how the Galactic Senate worked.
Right.
Which, and really that was about it. I didn't know. I didn't even know that Rey was the main character.
Oh, really? Wow. So you
Yeah,
just they gave you sort of just the basics to work around. That's
very, very little. Whereas when I went to go do Leia, Princess of Alderaan, they wanted Holdo in it, and I was like, sure, that'll be great.
Yep.
And I went to Lucasfilm headquarters, and they're like, okay, go into this room, and you can read the Last Jedi script. And you have to sign it in and out, and it's on the red paper, so you can't take pictures. And that was like a year before it came out. I think I read that before Rogue One came out. But I was like, hey, awesome, and I had a blast reading it, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
But then at the end, I was almost a little bit miffed because I was like, I didn't really need to know all this.
Yeah.
And showed it to me in the movie,
So Holdo, who the first, I guess if I remember correctly, if I'm getting my dates right, we read her name before we saw her in the movie. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. It feels like there's a lot of content, and I have trouble keeping up.
I know.
But so how is it seeing her come to life? Because it's one thing to read a character in a script; it's another to have an amazing actress like Laura Dern bring her to life, and have a director like Rian Johnson ask her how to play the part. And meanwhile, you've written a chunk of her life and her relationship with Leia. What was that like for you to go and see her come to life on the screen? Was she what you thought, what you wrote?
She was great. I mean, Laura Dern is amazing. And she found a fresh line read on May the Force be with you always. She said it some way nobody had ever said it before, and it still sounded incredibly heartfelt and true, which was amazing. It was interesting. They had wanted to show me some rushes of her performance, and that they just couldn't get permission to do in the end. But it was great to see her and, imagine that this life that she's led, because obviously she's been there in the fight with Leia this whole time.
Right.
And, I know some readers were sort of like, she isn't acting like she did in the movie. And I'm like, well, she's a 15-year-old hanging out with her friends mostly in the first one. And, you hope that, say, like, Dwight Eisenhower was slightly different hanging out with friends that he was at D-Day, that there was a little bit of a change. But it was fun to sort of show the idea of somebody who was a little bit more eccentric and a little bit more somebody who was hard for other people to read.
Yeah.
And show her sort of bring herself a little bit back. She's not at the end of Leia, Princess of Alderaan. She's being a little bit less quirky just because she feels like she's forcing that, and she's sort of finding her true self, who is still a little bit, peculiar, but she's finding the truth of that.
That's great. That's really great. And did you reference any Laura Dern once you knew that she was playing the part, or did you just say I'm going to write her the way I want to write her? Or
I knew it was Laura Dern very early on. I think we all knew Laura Dern had been cast, and maybe not the character's name yet.
Right.
But yeah, so I knew it was her, and so there are all these references to Holdo being really sort of tall and lanky.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, that's great. So she's so seeing her come to life must have been pretty wild. So now you've also you have written now in the sequel trilogy, in the prequel trilogy, in the original trilogy, and now in the prequel era. Which one do you find the most fun to write in? I know that's a difficult question to answer, but
I mean, they're all fun. It's less a question of when it's set and more how big a slice of the story do you get to play with,
right?
Because when you don't let just people type up things about Spock becoming a pirate like crazy, and all the books have to work together, you have to acknowledge other people are telling parts of the story. Right. And sometimes it can feel kind of confining. Like Bloodline was really hard sometimes because I would want to do something and be like, you can't do that, and we can't tell you why. When I do something else, I'm like, does that fix it? And they're like, warmer. Guessing. And that's tough. But, whereas with like Lost Stars, the events of the original trilogy are pretty well established. So that was a lot easier. One of my big dreams would be to go prequel trilogy. My hope is that someday there's going to be more with Knights of the Old Republic, the original story. I think it's one of the great Star Wars stories. And I would love to try and write something in that. So I guess what I'm saying here is I want to write all of the stories all the time.
I'll take it. I'll take any of them, right? Yeah. Okay. Fair. But let's talk Master and Apprentice a little bit. And I want to talk about the short story from a certain point of view. I like them. I mean, I would like to talk about what the relationship is between the two a little bit. But there's one of the early interviews that I did here on Around the Galaxy was with Anthony Bresnikan, and I asked him what his favorite Star Wars story was, and he said that story from a certain point of view. And he retells it almost in the interview, and he gets choked up about it because it's a really beautifully put together story. Did you let how did you let them influence each other? The novel, which obviously takes place way before Obi-Wan or before Qui-Gon dies, and how did you find that you were drawing from obviously the same characters, but what's the evolution? I mean, it's weird. You started at the end of the story from a certain point of view, and then you almost went back to near the beginning of it. How was it to maybe go back to from one story to the next?
The story was a lot easier than the novel, and not just because it was a story instead of a novel. I mean, we're told at the end of Revenge of the Sith that Qui-Gon has figured out how to come back, that he can communicate, and he's the first Jedi Master, and I don't know when to be able to do this. And so it makes sense that eventually he would be able to actually manifest as a Force ghost, because, I mean, Obi-Wan learned it from somewhere, and that he would be present to some extent. And it made sense to me also that, Obi-Wan really got stuck with, okay, you have to live alone in the desert with everybody calling you crazy for decades.
Right.
Enjoy that. Enjoy beautiful Tatooine. And it helps a little bit to think like, okay, he wasn't in total solitude. Qui-Gon was able to communicate with him and teach him even more through that. And it was also important because, it's very easy and very appropriate to question how Anakin was trained.
Right.
And whether it was a good idea to even begin this at all.
Yep.
And why Qui-Gon would leave that planet without that boy's mother, or why Obi-Wan was more flexible, or etc. And I wanted to acknowledge some of that, but I also felt like it was important to establish or to say that in the end, Anakin's choice is his own. Because if it isn't, the entire saga doesn't really have the same meaning.
Right.
He has agency, and I forget exactly how Qui-Gon puts it, but he says something like, mistakes were made, but he still had enough. Anakin still had enough to choose better, and he didn't.
Right.
So that came from that. And then going back to the novel, I'd been wanting to write a Qui-Gon novel for years, and then I got the chance, and then kind of hit a brick wall because I realized what I really wanted to write was like a 4 or 5 volume biography of Qui-Gon Jinn, which, strangely enough, not on the Lucasfilm publishing schedule. And so I had to narrow this down, and I had a pretty broad, it was like, it can be set sort of whenever, Obi-Wan's younger, so there was a lot of flexibility there. And
pretty broad palette to work from. They'll just be younger. Write a story.
They'll be younger. What exactly do you get to play with? And it was kind of hard to sort through like all the different things that I wanted to say about these characters with what I was going to say, and what finally wound up being the thing, like the one critical question, because I feel like if you want your book to feel necessary, it has to deliver some insight or some piece of information that you didn't get anywhere else. And I thought what this needed to do was say, like, why does Qui-Gon believe so wholeheartedly in those prophecies when pretty much nobody else around him does?
Right.
Not even the Jedi mystics.
Yep.
Because it's his belief in those that, that starts everything.
Right.
If he doesn't believe those, the story with Anakin doesn't even get started. So why does he think this? Why is he so sold on it? And once I was able to say, okay, that's the center point of the story, everything else kind of began to fall into place. And you mentioned Kevin Scott earlier, and it was great because while I was working on that, he was working on Dooku Jedi Lost. And we were able to communicate a lot going back and forth to make sure that sort of Dooku and Qui-Gon's history would track the same way. And, Rael Averross I came up with, and then Cav put him in Dooku Jedi Lost, which was great. And I was like, how dare you write better Rail dialogue than me? I'm angered. But making sure that it also worked together, because you did have Dooku, he too was an iconoclast within Jedi Order in a very different way.
Right.
And so how would that play out? Anyway, have I answered your question? Because I have really
no, you have. I mean, I think, as I said, I think the certain point of view, I think is one of the most important Star Wars books that not everybody has read, because it's just these little tiny, some of the short stories are incredibly short, but every one of them tells you from a certain point of view, which of course is what I love about that book. And I think that story with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon helps to fill the gap that I would rather them not make the Obi-Wan series now that I've read your story, because I feel like I know enough about that. And I of course I'm going to be there first thing in the morning when it comes out, of course.
Oh yeah, and you're going to be in line behind me.
That's right. Would you maybe that's an interesting question for you. Have you written any screenplays? I mean, I know you have some DC graphic novels, which are similar, I suppose, in the way you're
coming out. Yeah. No, I haven't written any screenplays. It would be fun if that were ever to happen, but no. It would be awesome though.
Yeah, they need to tap you for the Obi-Wan series, because you built him out there, right? I mean, you did a really nice job of capturing just that sort of that, which I thought that in the Rebels cartoon they also did a cartoon animation. They did a nice job of kind of capturing that desolate yet sort of that isolation of being Obi-Wan Kenobi, which I
think he's such an interesting character to me, because if you look at it, he was given every reason to turn to darkness. He loses everybody he actually cared about, either to death or, in Anakin's case, something worse.
Mm-hmm.
He loses the entire framework that gave his life meaning. Again, he's stranded in the desert with everybody calling him crazy for decades, and he never wavers. Like, he doesn't falter. He's on that path, and I like that. I'm very drawn to that, and I'm very intrigued. I mean, I don't have any idea what's going on with Kenobi whatsoever. So, because sometimes I would tweet something like, "Oh, wouldn't it be fun if?" and there would be all these things that would go up on websites going, "Lucasfilm source confirms that." I know nothing about Kenobi, but I'm really interested to see what they're going to come up with. And where they're going to go with it. I hope it's not all on Tatooine. I think he stayed there very much to look over Luke, but a week sometime, if there was something pressing going on, I can believe, because he doesn't seem to have really played a big part in Luke's life either.
Right.
And I'm also interested in the time period.
Yes.
Between the prequels and the original trilogy. So getting a window on that is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it should be really interesting to. It's funny. It's one of the, just like, honestly, like Solo. I was like, yeah, do I need that story? Wow, it turns out I really loved it. It was really cool, and I think that's what's great about exploring all the time gaps, that Star Wars leaves just enough time so that it's so vast that you can go and dig into it, and you can explore different pieces of it and still want more, right? It's not like it's not like they're so close together.
It's a big world, and you knew even from A New Hope that this was a world that had centuries or millennia of history.
Right.
You somehow knew that from the get-go. It felt lived in a way that I don't think any science fiction universe before it had.
Right.
You just knew. And so, I think we're all hungry to find out all the different stories that could be out there.
Yeah, and you've given us some really fantastic stories. Are there any characters that you want to go back to? If they said any original character, let's say any original character that you created that wasn't in one of the films before, which character would you most like to explore further that you've created?
I had really wanted to write a book with Leia breaking Ransom Castro out of prison, and then they put that in another book, which, that's, you're writing for tie-ins, and that's the reality. And, Rebecca Roanhorse loves the character, and she did a great job, but like, that was really a book that I desperately wanted to write. So that was pretty disappointing. But beyond that, who would I want to go back to originally? I mean, Thane and Sienna, I guess.
Yeah.
Them. Yeah. I hope that there's going to be a Lost Stars 2 someday, but no news.
I feel like that's something that everybody would absolutely lose their mind over and would love to see. It's such a well received story, and I really liked the way that you sort of flipped the sort of the idealism of the Imperial and the sort of aggressiveness, for lack of a better term, of the rebel characters.
Yeah.
And it just kind of, and I think that's one thing that I found, and your perspective on this would be really interesting. But I find it very interesting that Star Wars in the 70s and 80s was idealistic, right? The Jedi Knights were these perfect untouchables that we all wanted to be. The prequels really started to shine a light on maybe they drank too much of their own Kool-Aid and they're kind of maybe missing the picture. And then the sequels were like, hey, be careful of how much praise and what pedestal you put your heroes on, because it might not, they can't live up to it.
Yeah.
And the way you took Lost Stars, which takes place sort of right in the middle of it all, like, and started to shine a different light on it. Is that was that one of the things that attracted you to writing the story, or that you wanted to lead with? Or
honestly, at first it was just, it's Star Wars, right?
Right.
But I did think the idea of having an Imperial who, wasn't an evil person, because they can't all be.
Right.
What do the average people working on these enormous ships, which are, the size, what is it? The Star Destroyer is about the size of Manhattan.
Right.
And I am completely blanking out the Dreadnought. Is that what it's called from The Last Jedi?
Oh yeah. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, that has roughly the same like surface area as Pluto. Like all those people and all those ships can't be, horrible human beings. And so, what do people know? The big attraction to me was, these are not people who get to go into the briefing, or they don't get to look at the master plans. They're not there when whatever gives the speech.
Right.
They're just caught up in this. This is the world that's happening around them. How much would you know? What would you assess? Like, when would you find things out, and how would you determine this? Like, it was really fun getting into the fact that after the Death Star blew up, there would be a period of extreme confusion.
Right.
Because a ton of the top brass is dead.
Yep.
The Empire and Palpatine are not going to want to admit, a disaster of this magnitude, and yet at the same time, they blew up a planet, and they can't pretend that part didn't exist. And like, just showing like that would be a really chaotic and confusing time for everybody. They really wouldn't know what was happening.
Yeah. No, and I think that's what's really cool about where Star Wars is today. Is it's in a way kind of, and maybe this is why Han Solo was always one of my favorite characters, was because he was mythical in his status, but he was achievable, right? And in a way, like he's cool and dorky, so it could work out. I could go that way, and I think that's what's great about where Star Wars is now, is you're learning about, you're not just seeing Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin, very interesting characters, but what's happening levels and levels and levels below them and around them, and what are the decision points that are going into
and that's one of the things I've really loved about The Mandalorian, is the way they're making it clear that the fall of the Empire doesn't play out identically all over the galaxy. That there are a lot of situations that are every planet you go to, is a different scenario. One place is some Imperial guys are hanging on kind of as warlords, and
Right.
other places you've started to have the Republic and law and order, and then you have other places that were barely touched by the Empire and don't really care what happened. They just want to catch blue shrimp all day.
And play with Baby Yoda.
Well, I would accept that life immediately. Eating shrimp and playing with Baby Yoda, it's like,
Sign me up.
life, man.
I'll deal with the occasional ATSD attack if I have to.
Oh, and that's another thing I love about The Mandalorian. I'm just going off now.
Oh, please.
Is that by making the stakes smaller, they
Right.
made them so much more interesting.
Yeah.
One Walker, one
Right.
is enough to wipe out hundreds of people. Like, you are so screwed. And just one is threat enough, or one TIE fighter.
Right.
What are you going to do? Nothing. You are in trouble.
Right.
And, I feel like both in the prequels and the sequels, to some extent, there was this idea like, oh, we'll pile on more. Look how
Right.
many ships are now. And when really at that point, it just becomes, litter in your eyes. You're not feeling the impact of it. But when you have people out there with sticks in the night, like cowering, by the river, and this one huge thing is coming out that can kill them, you feel it.
Yeah.
Feel it.
It's really great to hear you say that, because I think one of the things, and I'll be very careful not to go into Last Jedi: Rise of Skywalker, because there's so much tension around it for no reason. But I think one of the challenges and one of the things that I really came to like about Last Jedi is that it is a smaller movie, right? And the way I've put it before is, there's galactic consequences in all 8 of the other films. But at the end of the day, Last Jedi, sure, it started with sort of the escape, but it was a very personal story. And
Yeah.
that personal story happened to take place around the famous Luke Skywalker and this emerging young Jedi and the grandson of Darth Vader. But it was a very personal story. And I think when I walked out of it, that was, I've said it 100 times on my show, and it's true. When I walked out of Last Jedi, I thought it was both the best and the worst Star Wars movie I'd ever seen at that moment. When I walked out, I was like, I don't know what to think. I loved it, but I don't know how I feel about it. And I've come around to it because it told that personal story to some very major characters. And I hadn't thought about that's why The Mandalorian works. But you're right. I mean, even a gunfight in the streets it's
amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've made no secret, I really love The Last Jedi, and I will now say why. But one, because of that, it is more personal, and it actually gets into people's thought patterns and flaws and doubts, while still, coming true to sort of the heroism. But the thing I loved about it the most is, in Star Wars, you keep hearing all the time about hope. You have to have hope. And on the one hand, you have Finn and Rose going off on this cockamamie mission, but it also makes it clear that's not hope.
Right.
That's just like pretending the odds don't apply to you.
Right. That's desperation. Right.
But sometimes it doesn't. Hope is what Luke does in the end. It's looking at everything that could go wrong and has gone wrong and moving forward anyway. That's the only place hope comes from.
Right.
If you're not looking at that, it's not hope. It's just, not facing facts.
Right.
And I loved that they actually dug into that really, it should get harder. It should be more complicated as you go further on in this journey. And I felt like they got there. And, compared to that, I don't really care that Canto Bite went on a little too long. I don't know. Anyway, like you said, we shouldn't get into it.
Yeah, no, it's one of those movies that it's funny. I said it, I after I saw Knives Out, actually, I liked it even more because I understood the way Rian Johnson told stories, and then I watched Star Wars a little bit differently, and it was so cool. And that's what I love about Rian Johnson's story here. And again, I'll be really careful because I could piss off a lot of people. But he tells that story incredibly well. And I think it was Charles Soule who tweeted not too long ago, and I could be wrong. I hope I'm not misquoting, but he said he just realized that her name is Rey, as in ray of light, and right. And when you said hope, she is the ray of hope that pulls Luke back into the fight, even from across the galaxy. He's pulled back into the fight because of her, and that's really great.
Yeah.
talk about it for days, and it's
Yeah.
dangerous. Well, so now that the Skywalker saga is over, if you we just talked a little bit about hope. What's the overarching theme to you, just to all 9 films?
Ooh. I mean, I guess really the first word that's coming to mind here is friendship, in a way, in the sense that it's the personal acts of trust and hope between people that change everything
Mm.
in the end. Yeah, you have the Palpatine with his 90,000 plans within plans, and have huge armies fighting things out. But in the end, Star Wars comes down to, do these people trust each other? Do these people love each other?
Mm.
And the prequel trilogy is the one where the answer ultimately is no.
Yeah.
One person in the most devastating way, and that's the tragedy.
Mm.
The other two, ultimately the answer is yes, and they deliver the place into something brighter. And I think maybe that is what I'm saying. Yeah, actually, I'll go with that, because if you look at A New Hope, it is the idea that these few people can create great change.
Right.
And it's not just through doing the huge heroic thing, even though obviously a lot of that is involved, but in sort of daring to care about each other.
Right.
Han Solo coming back is what makes that movie.
Right.
And he doesn't come back for glory. He doesn't come back for money. He comes back because he cares about Luke and about Leia.
Yeah. Yep. That's and I think I would agree with that. I think that it's family and found family and friendship and trust, and I think that's great. Well, cool. Well, I'm at the point in the show where if I keep talking, we'll be talking about for hours. But I do want to. I have this 10 question thing that I've asked everybody, and I want to make sure that I get to you, because these are fun. I think. I don't know. You might hate them. And
all right, I'll do my best.
All right. So the first question is, what is your favorite Star Wars movie, TV show, or book? And you can't say a Claudia Gray book. I'm sorry. Although many have said those.
I mean, I still got to say Empire, and I know everybody says that, so sorry, but that one was huge, and it really took the entire thing in different directions. It gave it some darkness and so much more breadth,
right,
and depth of the story, and it introduced all these amazing complications that were still playing out all this time later. Television shows, I mean, I really love sort of the middle seasons of the Clone Wars, and those last 4 episodes. Oh my God, that just coming out. How great was that?
It was some of the best Star Wars of all. I don't care, books, movies, TV, some of the best Star Wars stories I've seen. Yes.
The final 3 episodes are basically like the longest and greatest Star Wars action scene ever.
Yes.
You know, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Love it. And I do love The Mandalorian a lot. At first I was enjoying it, and then we got to those final 2 episodes, and I was like, oh, now I work with this thing. This is great.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm super psyched for Taika Waititi.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what he's going to do.
He'd do anything. I'm going to be like, I'm there. Okay.
It's true. And I think that's, have you watched much of the Gallery series? The sort of behind the scenes on Disney Plus?
No, I don't always watch all the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah.
I kind of prefer sometimes not knowing, but I know I'll break down eventually and see.
I think it's worth it, if for no other reason, to hear the way Dave Filoni talks with such reverence about the story of Star Wars. The way I put it is, and since you haven't seen it, it won't mean as much to you, but I find it really fun to watch Filoni sitting at a round table with Jon Favreau and Bryce Dallas Howard and Taika Waititi, these Hollywood types, and Dave Filoni is the nerd in the room, and I love it. It's like you can tell he's like, he knows more about, the dimension of a lightsaber handle than they will ever care to know. But he's in it. It's great to see. But and I think that's the one thing that's deceiving about it, because it's less about, they just did a technology episode, but it's more about what went into it. And it's interesting. I would recommend it from one fan to another. would recommend.
It'll happen.
You'll get to it. Yeah, there'll be a slow day one time. And now I have to ask you what's your least favorite. This is always dangerous. Jason Fry, I'll give you his out. He said that at the time there were 10 Star Wars films. He said his 10th favorite. So you can be as safe as you like with your answer.
It's Attack of the Clones. It just is. It just is. I mean,
it just is. That's the best.
Well, I think, there's so many things going wrong there. Like, one, it's like the Jedi really is like, oh, hey, we showed up with like jillion clones. You know, this other guy, Cypher Diaz, he just put that down on credit. So we're going to build him now.
Nobody checked the Amex bill?
We gave him like the black card Amex of the Jedi at some point. And they're like, oh, a whole army? I guess we'll use that. Nobody has any questions about that whatsoever. There's no existing military structure they might turn to first, you know. Right. Okay. But really the part of it that makes it my least favorite is that they I think pretty much everybody would agree they did not do the best job with the romance. No. And one, it sort of gave romance a bad name in the Star Wars universe that it's only now starting to shed. Right. When romance, like if you look at the storytelling trope Star Wars pulls from, romance is an inextricable part of that. Like that should never have been exiled or shoved in a corner. It should be mixed in with it. And also because we were in movies, that was the one thing we were given with, adult Anakin. That was to make us invest in him, right, and care about him. That was really the thing. And when you flub that, then you've really put a foot wrong. This is the thing that the Clone Wars did so much better because they actually had time to show you Anakin being brave and great with Ahsoka, and show him being a little bit arrogant and a little bit possessive and too quick with his temper. You know, they were able to show that nuance, and it admittedly would be a whole lot harder, maybe impossible to do it in a movie, but Attack of the Clones did not do it.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you there. You said Ahsoka. I've said this a lot, and that is, when I saw the Clone Wars animation, the cartoon movie, the first time, I like the whole Snip Sky Guy thing. I was totally turned off, and now I'm an Ahsoka Tano fan, huge fan. Would you ever want to write for her?
Oh gosh, Kate Johnston's done that so well. I don't know whether I want to follow in those footsteps. Let's put it this way: I want to see her again.
Yes. Okay.
I don't care in what. I don't care how. I just want to have more Ahsoka out there.
That's fair. Totally fair. All right. The third question is: would you consider yourself an Imperial or a Rebel?
Oh, I'm a Rebel.
I think you've written some pretty good Rebels, and it sounds like that's your approach.
Yeah, and the Imperial outfits, they look really uncomfortable. Like, I was fine with the fact that they showed the laundry in The Last Jedi because those are people that are big with starch. Let's just know that. They do. Like, they are all uncomfortable all the time, and that's why they're grumpy.
The spice mines and the starch mines were this.
Yeah, the starch mines.
There you go. There's your next book. Yeah. What's your favorite Star Wars sound effect?
Ooh, I got to think about that. Is BB-8 an answer? I would probably say BB-8. I thought he was great, or it was sort of like I saw somebody online going, it's like the idea for BB-8 was they said R2-D2 but cuter, so cute you die. And I love the fact that they gave him a distinctive voice.
Yeah,
he doesn't sound like R2. He doesn't sound like Chopper. He has his own little sound that is just as expressive and just as endearing. And I thought not only being able to do that, but being able to do that in a completely new way was pretty ingenious.
Yeah, I remember in The Force Awakens when Rey is given the opportunity to sell him, and he looks up at her. JJ was able to take this little metal ball, and that one eye was very Puss in Boots and almost purring, and just you fell in love with that character, and the sound has so much to do with it. You're 100% right. And it's funny because the next question on my list is, who's your favorite droid? R2-D2, C-3PO, or BB-8?
Ooh, it may have to be BB-8, and I feel like so much like I'm betraying R2D2 with that, but I think BB-8 got me at the flame thumbs up, like, genius. That, and also having written C-3PO, I can tell you he's very difficult to write. Like at first, I was like, why can't I get this voice? And I realized the trick was about half of his sentences have to end in exclamation points. Because as far as he's concerned, everything he's saying is the most important thing ever. So yeah, I guess I'm going to go with BB-8.
Excellent. Next time you speak to Jason Fry, you have to ask him about C-3PO. He went off on my show for a couple minutes about how C-3PO is secretly just the worst sentient being in the entire universe, the most worried about it. It was really great. But we actually started a hashtag called C-3PO is a monster after he was on the show. So next time you speak to him, ask him. What spaceship or vehicle from the Star Wars universe would you most like to own?
I mean, I know the quick answer to the Millennium Falcon, but I have done some hard thinking about what the seat cushions of the Millennium Falcon must be like. Han Solo's not in there with a dustbuster, vigilantly. Like, I don't know. Actually,
there are some Taco Bell wrappers behind those seats.
Someone's nothing but Taco Bell wrappers at this point. What would I most want? I don't know the specifics, but it would be something from the prequel era when you still had all this aesthetic design that was so beautiful and fluid. And you would imagine in a time of peace, probably a little bit more comfortable because, honestly, if we're going to travel the galaxy in any ship, I'm going to pick the NCC 1701D. This is a floating Hilton with magic boxes that make whatever food you want. I want that one actually, but I want the closest thing I could get to that in the prequel era.
Excellent, that's fair.
Yeah.
All right, you have to pick one: Porg, Ewok, or Jar Jar Binks. Which is your favorite of those three?
Well, what am I picking for? Like,
it's I love the question on the question for people when I throw that. Some are wondering like which one would you want to eat. Some are like I don't know. I'll tell you why they're in there, and then you can choose. I chose the one sort of character or creature that people said was the most commercial of the trilogies that they belonged in. So if you had to pick one that was your favorite of the three.
Well, I mean, for cuteness, I picked the Porgs. They're pretty great.
Yeah.
And I love their wary detente turning into near worship of Chewbacca. Obviously for murder, I picked the Ewoks. They're little murder bears, and we all know it. And I think it is worth remembering that Chief Chirpa got closer to taking out Han Solo than Boba Fett ever did.
I love that. That's a great
Han had like 20 seconds to go. That was it. If Leia hadn't been doing some diplomacy, like he would be some brisket. Brisket somewhere. Jar Jar, I never hated the character as much as some people did, but I certainly didn't enjoy it until the Clone Wars, where I felt like they actually found the balance and made him work. He would still have his goofiness, but it would play into the story in a more intelligent way. Like there's one thing where he's deliberately being very goofy at this big dinner because a ship is going by that the people in this room can't see. Right. And so he's making the spectacle of himself and being a wonderful diversionary tactic there. So, so for diversions, Jar Jar; for cuteness, Porgs; for murder, Ewok.
Maybe I'll have to switch the question up and I'll have to ask it with those three indicators. Okay, so if you could be any character in Star Wars, who would it be and why would you choose that person?
Ooh. Yeah, it's hard because I love Leia so much, but she has a hard life in a lot of ways. Yeah. I mean, and we know now the fight never stopped. She picks that up when she's 16 and it never stopped. That's hard.
Yeah.
And what happens with her son is really tragic. I guess maybe I'd want to be, I know who I want to be. I want to be Baby Yoda.
Baby.
Naps and snacks, and you got a hover pod, and you're just hanging out. And then when things get rough, you use magic, and everything's okay. And that's as sweet as it gets in the Star Wars universe.
Who would have thought? And I'm so glad. I'm so glad I was not spoiled, because when I saw
Oh,
that, it's one of the few moments in my life where I saw something in entertainment and was like, "What? What did I just?
no. We had
What?"
some friends that were like, "Oh my god! Oh my! Did you see the? Oh my god!"
And he's become universal. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I loved reading all the Werner Herzog stuff about Baby Yoda.
Yeah.
Werner Herzog is not Mr. Softy, you know. So if you have Werner Herzog tearing up at the sight of the puppet, it's a good puppet.
You've done your job. That's right.
Yeah.
You've made it work. All right, so this kind of goes to one of the earlier questions I asked you about working in them. But what's your favorite trilogy? If you're going to watch all three of one of the groups, which one would it be?
Well, see, that's interesting because my favorite would be the original trilogy. But if I were going to sit down and watch them, like just of a random evening, at this point, I would probably pick the sequels just because, just through sheer time, I've seen them the least.
Right.
And am still getting to know them in some ways. And so, but I think the original ultimately holds better together the best.
Yeah. I would definitely. It's funny. It's in a lot of cases, I think it's the first one that you saw, and
Yeah.
and people go there. But yeah, I think I would agree with you. So my last question is, what is your favorite Star Wars quote?
My favorite Star Wars quote. Oh gosh. I'm gonna stick with "May the Force be with you." I know that is like super trite, but it's the Force is the thing that elevates the Star Wars mythos from being kind of like just another story.
Mhm.
The Force, and the projects where it's the strongest, I think, tend to be the strongest, even if it's just sort of on the side or a smaller part of it.
Mm.
Rogue One is so gritty, but through Chirrut, you have this incredible sense, and also like that character was the first one since really Yoda in Empire
Right.
that had really captured some of the sense of the mystic and the wonder. I felt like the prequels were sort of missing in that a little bit. You kind of had it with Qui-Gon, but you didn't feel it as much as you felt it with that character. So I'm going to stick with "May the Force be with you."
That's an excellent choice. Can't go
Mhm.
wrong with that.
Yeah.
So, well, Claudia, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It's really been a ton of fun. Where can people find you so they can follow you online?
Let's see. My website is claudiagray.com. That's Gray with an A. It is badly in need of updating. That'll be happening later on this year, but you can find links. I'm not super active on social media any longer, but between me and my assistant, we keep things up. I have a super dorky Tumblr, and yeah, I ought to be promoting myself all the time on the Tumblr. Instead, I'm like, here's a cat dressed like Han Solo. That's the real me, I guess. But it has links to my various platforms. So if you want to go to Instagram and see pictures of my new dog, you can do that. Or if you want to see the dorky Tumblr, you can do that. Or visit the Twitter where my assistant updates. Well, used to update on appearances, which he doesn't have to do now for a good long while.
Oof, yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you for the great stories you've brought to us, and looking forward to what you do with High Republic and that great team of other authors that you're working with. That's going to be such an exciting time. When does the first book? When's the slated date for release on that?
We have a date, and yet everything is so up in the air with what's going on in the world that it's beyond me. So
sometime later this year, hopefully, we'll be seeing.
Sometime later this year. I mean, at this point, we're all caught up. Like everybody's just having to surf this wave, and we'll see what we'll see. I've had a joy writing it. I can say that.
Excellent. Well, good. Well, we're all looking forward to it. And thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.